Currently, I'm the VP of Design at MTV over in Times Square, part of the Viacom family. A couple of brands that I have worked on over there are TRL, the MTV social impact campaign called Plus One to Vote, in order to encourage young voters to vote. Had a little bit of an uptick during the recent midterm elections. Also, a couple of brands you might be familiar with, like X on the Beach, very popular one out here. Just took it over to the States. MTV Cribs, and a couple of other things. So that's kind of the ecosystem that I operate in, and myself and a team and a couple of very talented teams help brand the MTV ecosystem. But originally, and still, I'm very much an artist. So I like to draw, and I started out as an editorial illustrator back in the day. And this is a very recent mural that I helped execute, or that I did execute. And it takes a lot of time and effort and a lot of thought behind it. And I'm still very much in touch with my creative roots. Here's another illustration I've done for Fast Company. This is about the future of virtual reality. Something like this takes a little bit of time, but of course, starting out as a bit more rough and tumble artist and taking it to a much more polished space, I've had the very much the pleasure of working in a few different mediums. Here's a couple more pieces that I've done. Also expressive, colorful, bright. The left is for Converse, the American basketball brand, part of the Nike family. And also to the right is for NPR, National Public Radio. I've also spent a lot of time within entertainment and within media. I spent a couple of years doing a lot of branding and design for theater back in New York, specifically Broadway. And also we would partner a lot with the productions here on the West End. So we worked on Stomp, worked on 20th anniversary. Finding Neverland is a couple of pieces that we did for that, as well as there's some pitch stuff for the King Kong musical of all things, as well as the Macbeth, the play, which was Alan Cummings' return to Broadway. A little bit about me. I'm very much a sports head, a sneaker head. I've done a lot of energy-based, expressive work for some basketball production magazines like Slam. Also grew up listening to hip-hop back in New Jersey, back in New York. So I've done a lot of work for XXL, and a lot of those kind of helped inform my current life. Also, I spent a couple of years working at Nike, which is an amazing brand I'm still very much a fan of. I was the head graphic designer of their young athletes category, doing a lot of energy-based work there. This is a jack-o'-lantern graphic on the back of a foamposite. Also, it glows in the dark. It's kind of fun. Here's a pack we did for the LeBron 14s. These are all based on different wrestlers, his favorite wrestlers after Cavaliers won the championship. So to the left is, can anyone name? The Ultimate Warrior? Anyone know what the middle one is? Undertaker? Undertaker, exactly. Dead man. And the one on the right is? Ric Flair. Close. No, but Ric Flair and Hogan, they're of the same generation for sure. And this is a piece that I did, or a project I worked on with Nike called the Hey Penny foamposites. And these were actually the #1 ranked kids shoe of 2017 according to Hypebeast Kids. So within the commercial space, I've definitely had the pleasure of taking my artistry, my creativity there. And also done a little bit of animation. Whoop, whoop, whoop. This is a segment of animation I had the pleasure of working on for an unreleased Freddie Mercury track with Queen a couple of years ago. It's about 7 minutes long, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But it is very long, and it was for Coke Red and AIDS awareness. And also, I host a podcast. It's called First Generation Burden. It's about immigration. We speak to immigrants and the children of immigrants. And I have the distinct pleasure of being within a wonderful circle back in New York of immigrants within the creative community. So I like to elevate those stories and push those to the forefront. And to the left, that's an amazing Mexican artist. His name is Ricardo Gonzalez, and his hashtag is It's a Living. So he's one to look for. All right, so what does that mean in terms of the toxic grid? So from a creative standpoint, a lot of my work has to do with representation. And representation within media, within TV, within magazines, within products. And there's a certain perspective that I like to approach my work with from a commercial space and also from a personal space. I just want to walk you through a little bit of my process in terms of how I try to represent within my work in the most authentic way possible. So a couple of the things I'm going to talk through are a couple of definitions. I want to tell a little bit of a story, the Tower of Babel. Some of you might be familiar with it. Also, who is yourself? All right, so a couple of definitions. So toxic, this is an easy one. It's poisonous. Don't eat it, don't drink it. Bad for your health, right? And the grid. So the grid, and I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. So the grid is a network of lines that cross each other to form a series of squares or rectangles. So from a design perspective, because in design we often deal with grids and we often deal with things that are restrictive in order to have a creative thought around it, we think of the grid in terms of systems, in terms of rhythm, proportions, and structure. Mostly, the grid is about structure. So the grid, when we think of it from a design perspective, is something like this, right? Where there's quantifiable content in a bunch of boxes, and the boxes are separated by vertical and horizontal lines. And it's somewhat organized, and this is true in print design, this is true in digital design, this is true in a lot of other forms of design in order to create balance. And balance is a good thing, but sometimes thinking in this context can be somewhat restrictive. Because in practice, a lot of times the grid looks like this. There's a lot of energy in the grid, and there are a lot of voices talking to each other. So one bit might be struggling for control to control its own section. Another piece might be rubbing up against another piece. One piece might be trying to look cool. Another piece might have a bit of tension there. One piece might be just completely out of whack. Or one other piece might be like really organized and have its stuff together. So in practice, the grid isn't always a straight up and down, left and right, one square equals one square scenario, right? So within our structure, every box is a voice. So I tend to not think of the grid as a space to hold binary content or numerical-based content. I think of it as a little voice. And the voice comes from a place. And that voice is often attributed to a person, a history, a place, or a thing. And there's a lot of baggage that comes with that voice. So a little bit of a story break. So the Tower of Babel, all right? This is something I think about a lot in terms of my design thinking, my design philosophy, and future thinking. So for those of you who aren't familiar, within the Judeo-Christian context, the Tower of Babel is a story in the book of Genesis, okay? So after the great flood, right, there was a big flood, Noah, 2 animals, all that stuff, okay? So after the flood, humanity is kind of getting its stuff back together, and it's like reorganizing. And then humanity's like, hey, why don't we build a tower? Why don't we build a tower, build a city, and we're going to shoot it right to heaven. We're going to touch God, okay? So God sees it, and God's like, whoa, everybody calm down. And then he smotes the whole thing. So he destroys the tower, destroys the city, and then he disperses all of humanity. And then all of humanity is all over the world, and they don't speak any of the same language. So he took the one unified language, then he broke it up. And then it's an origin story of why there's so many different diverse peoples around the world. So what does that mean? Our takeaway is that nothing ever lasts. So humanity wants to build a thing, circumstances happen, thing falls down, and then humanity moves on. It's pretty cyclical. It happens all the time. And I'm sure it's happened within our lives, within our generations. And even now we see it in a massive context right now, within a world context. And also I'm sure we see it in our individual lives. All right, so I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. And we're going to set up a little bit of our grid, of our own grid. So who is yourself? So we're going to set up an X and Y axis. The origin point is the self. Okay, so our first X-axis is going to be the magical and the vulgar. Okay, so just to show you a little bit, just to tell you a little bit about what I identify with and what I feel that I represent, I'm male. I'm an Asian American. Okay, my parents are immigrants. They came to America. And also I identify as a creative person. And those are the things that's some of my DNA, okay? So within that context, there's a magical self and a vulgar self, okay? So let's look a little bit at some representation that's related to me within that context. So growing up, a lot of the imagery that I would see that would represent someone that was male, that was Asian, that was in the world of media was a lot of this. So to the left, we have Pat Morita as the magical self, representing as Mr. Miyagi, where in the Karate Kid film, he helps Daniel's son win the karate tournament, right? And he's great, and everyone loves Mr. Miyagi. No one doesn't love Mr. Miyagi, right? And then to the right, we have Mickey Rooney in what is a vulgar depiction of a Japanese male in the film, in the film Breakfast at Tiffany's, right? He plays this character, Mr. Yuniyoshi. And it's otherwise a great film, a very obvious black eye, right? So this is the spectrum that, for me, was something that I looked at when I was younger. So here's another story break. So here are my parents. This is my mom, this is my dad. They're both alive, by the way, so don't worry about it. So my mom and my dad came to America from the country of the Philippines in the late 60s. And they came when they had just turned 20. They hadn't met yet. And my dad, he left because his father had died, and he was the youngest of 9 kids. And my mom was the oldest of 10 kids. And she left also when her father died. And they both went to America because they had to make a better life for their families back in the Philippines. So that meant that they had to work 10 times as hard in order to send money back home to feed their 9 or 10 siblings, right? So that's something that I wrestle with since birth. And I think about it all the time. I think, man, my dad, he ended up becoming an architect, and he's great. He's retired. He's busy being a granddad. And my mom was a great physician. She did it for 30 years. She's retired, being a grandmom. And for me, I always think, I'm not going to mess up that legacy. Like, I'm not going to be the idiot that messes that up, okay? Because they sacrificed too much for me to be a jerk, right? So that brings me to the individual and the culture. So from an individual self, that's an easy one. That's just who we are as a solo person. Kind of our selfish self. It doesn't always have to be selfish, but what is it that makes you you? Well, then from a cultural perspective, for me, there was a lot of looking back and a lot of looking at the things that had come before me in order to inform my current self. And I think about a lot of the people that I work with, that there's a lot that informs what they do, what their work looks like, because there is their individual and there's their cultural self. All right, so let's look at our new grid here within our new X and Y axis. So there is a magical self, the vulgar self, the individual, and the culture, and all originates to create this one little point of origin that's a little bit more holistic, right? And that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of baggage, and that's a lot of voices. A lot of voices informing each other that all are not wrestling for control, but are also looking for some sort of harmony, right? So onward and upward. What does that mean? So does anyone know who this is? Has anyone seen this movie? Raise your hand. Rufio, I heard someone say it. Rufio. Exactly. So Rufio is a character from the movie Hook. Now, to give you a little bit of insight, I'm 37 years old. When Hook came out, I was 9, I think, 9 or 10. And for me, when I saw this, it was the first time that I'd seen representation of a person that kind of looked like me within the media space, that felt empowered, that felt like, oh, you didn't have to be a Mr. Miyagi type guy. You didn't have to be a breakfast at Tiffany's type of guy. Here is someone that was independent of, you know, the culture of my parents. They didn't have that baggage. And also someone that wasn't like me. So there was a point that felt that it was a bit of a wake-up call and a bit of like a ding, you know, where it showed me like, oh, there's some possibilities here. Like there's a world within representation, within media, where I could exist. And also, just as another aside, when I was a kid, I was a big fan of Saved by the Bell. Does anyone know Saved by the Bell here? All right. So Saved by the Bell was a great show. I was still a big fan of it. It was on NBC, and I'd see it on Saturday mornings. And I was a big fan of Zach Morris, okay? And Zach Morris, if you don't know, he had a big cell phone, brick of a phone. He'd call his friends, his attractive friends, and they'd all go hang out at the mall, and he was a cool guy. I love Zach Morris. But then, and I would identify with Zach Morris. But then I look in the mirror, and then I'd see all of a sudden that the spell was broken, and I didn't look like that. I didn't feel like that, because that level of representation didn't exist for me. So then this, seeing Rufio on screen, was actually a big moment. So let's take our grid. Let's put it on its back. Let's get a little three-dimensional here. And let's start building around these pieces that make up our self, right? So we got a wall here, a wall here, a little bit of pyramid situation. And then it reaches this apex. And then when the apex is an aspirational self. So an aspirational self, in order to get there, you kind of have to acknowledge all the other pieces of yourself. Because once you have all those pieces and you wrestle with that stuff, those voices, they can actually grow and push and keep going. And what does that mean? It means that we're always going to seek structures. So going back to the Tower of Babel, going back to the grid. As human beings, we're looking for structure. And as a designer, I'm looking for structure. I want to be able to build around something that I feel is legitimate and real and strong. And when I design something, I'm always thinking, is this going to last? Is this meant to be ephemeral? Is this meant to be something disposable? Or is this something that I want to last a few rounds or even a few generations? So we have to acknowledge the voices, because all the voices really are the cumulative, they accumulate into something that is strong and powerful. And when you acknowledge the voices, the grid actually fits us and not the other way around. So you can take something that's traditionally like this, a little stiff with quantifiable content, slightly cold, into something that's actually a little bit more fun, a little more energetic, and it can fit a lot of different types of content, a lot of different types of design, and a lot of different people and voices. Thank you.